Hi everyone, my name is Vasily Olenik. I'm a .NET developer, and in this video we're gonna take a look at how you can deal with external HTTP APIs inside your integration tests. It's common nowadays for our systems to communicate with some form of HTTP APIs, since most of the value from a system comes from its integrations with internal or external APIs. However, there is a catch. So basically that API might be unavailable or might have some form of licensing inside it, so you're gonna pay for calls to that API. That's not really fine in case you're running a pretty large test suite or if you're running tests in parallel. Heck, you can get even into rate limiting scenarios, even if you don't have subscriptions of that sort. Now you can ask me why we can't just mock out the HTTP message handler and be done with it. Well, mocking an HTTP handler might seem like a good idea, but you can't really simulate pragmatically all the real-world scenarios like network delays, timeouts, the service being unavailable, etc. Without testing against these specific edge cases, you might run into some issues or features when running in production. On the other hand, you have stubs. However, I have a small issue with those from my past experience. We had a pretty large test suite and it was a hassle to maintain those stubs. However, there is an alternative. It might sound pretty simple and straightforward, but in order to run our tests, we don't necessarily need to call those external APIs. We can call a mocked out instance of the API that will behave in a similar fashion to the one that we need. This is where WireMock comes in. Basically, by using this library, we can set up an in-memory API that will behave like the real instance. It can respond to URL, paths, header values, cookies, etc. It's really configurable. And it's pretty easy to use with what we have built up so far in the previous two videos. So without further ado, let's get straight to it. The first thing that we will need is basically an HTTP client to call that external service. For our habit tracker API, let's suppose we will have an external payment service. So I'm gonna add one payment folder over here, and I'm going to add the external service itself. And we're gonna name it payment service client. It's going to receive a private read-only HTTP client, which we are going to inject via the constructor, and over here we're gonna have just a small method, public async task retrieve payment status async, and we will need an ID. And over here I have a typo. I'll need a public class response, which is going to have just a simple string called status. And over here we're gonna just call the external API for a specific response. We don't need any kind of magic over here since it's just a proof of concept. Now what we will also need is an endpoint definition, and over here we're just gonna map get a specific path and return a results.ok client retrieve payment status async with an ID. Now with that in place, the last piece to the puzzle for habit tracker API is the service installer. And over here services, add HTTP client, and here specify some options, namely that the base address is gonna be https example.com, and I need to make this a new URI. So now that we have all that in place, I'm just going to move it all to specific classes, and now inside the program we just need to call builder services add payment services. With that in place, we have an endpoint definition that calls via the HTTP client a imaginary example.com API from which we will retrieve the payment status by a specific ID. The next thing that we need to do is basically modify our tests a little bit. Over here I just want to add one directory called in infrastructure, and then another directory called tests. I'm going to move the create habit endpoint tests into the tests folder and API factory inside the infrastructure. Now, for us to run the WireMock instance, we're gonna need to manage NuGet packages, and over here we're gonna need to add WireMock NuGet, and we need wiremock.net and wiremock.net test containers. And now, technically, we can run WireMock without test containers at all. However, since the previous video we've set up all the infrastructure running test containers, I decided to give the WireMock test containers a run for its money. Overall, I didn't find any good tutorial online on how to use WireMock with test containers, so that was a small challenge for me. But keep in mind that you can perfectly fine run WireMock without the need of test containers in your situations. Now, with all that in place, what we need to do is first close this, and then we're gonna add a payment API server. This one will inherit from iAsync disposable, the already familiar interfaces, and we're gonna implement the missing member. Now, what we need over here is a container instance for our WireMock. So we will need just to have a private WireMock container that we're gonna call payment API, and it's gonna be a new WireMock container builder with auto remove and with cleanup set true as well. So just build. Now we will also need the public URL for this payment API. So I'm gonna define it URL, and then we're gonna use get public URL. Next we'll need just a small method, public async task start, which we're gonna use for our payment API to start async, and await this call. And inside our dispose async, we're just gonna run payment API dot dispose async, and then as well payment API stop async. Now we'll need a way to set up an API response for a specific request. For that, I'm gonna define over here a small method, which is going to be a public async task set up payment, which is going to receive an ID and as well a boolean is successful. The status itself is gonna be pretty straightforward, so it's gonna be just a boolean check on this is successful and either payment succeeded or payment failed. Next we need the response itself, which is gonna be a new payment status response, and the status itself is gonna be the one that we defined on line 29. Now comes the fun part, and namely the setup of the response, and the WireMock instance inside the container is set up differently from the usual one. So we're gonna need a mapping builder instance, which we can retrieve from the payment API by generating a WireMock admin client, and then from here getting the mapping builder. Now I'll paste real quick a mapping setup right now. So in here we can set up that given a request, a get request with a specific path to our WireMock API instance, we're gonna respond with the body, inside of which we're gonna serialize our payment status respond and respond with a status code 200. Now the difference and what I didn't find inside the documentation itself is basically that after setting up the mappings, you will still need to await and then specify the mapping builder post async, which is pretty intuitive since you're building here the setup and you still need to save it to the admin page as well. However, that was everything that we needed for our payment API server. Now we just need to go to the API factory and do some changes over here. The first thing that we will need is over here. We're gonna need a public payment API server that we're gonna call external payment API. I'm gonna create a getter, and over here just create it like this. Next, we need to go down here inside the configure web host and override the URL for our service. So I'm gonna do services add HTTP client, and over here payment service client, and specify the options, and namely that the base address is gonna be a new URI, and we're gonna use the external payment API URL. We will need to await and start it, and then when disposing we will need to stop it by disposing async, and that's it. Now let me just refactor this and adjust the namespaces. So closing everything, and I'm gonna create a payment endpoint tests. This will be also an I-class fixture of API factory. We will need a private read-only HTTP client, which is gonna be our habits API. And then just like in the previous video, we're gonna need a private func of int boolean task, which we're gonna call setup payment. Generate a constructor, inject over here the API factory, and over here habits API is gonna be the web application factory HTTP client, and setup payment is gonna be a web application factory external API, and then setup payment like this. So we're basically exposing the external API through our web application factory over here, and inside the external payment API we have the setup payment method, which is publicly available, so our tests can set up their own responses to specific requests. Now what we need is a basic test. So response is success, status code should be true, var payment status equals response content read from JSON async status response, and await this call. Now payment status should be payment succeeded. I'm gonna put a breakpoint over here. I'll go over to as well to the payments part inside the payment service client and put a breakpoint over here as well, just to show you what is happening over there. So I'm gonna debug the integration test. Inside the Docker dashboard we can see that we have our SQL database, and then we have our WireMock instance. If I debug and go next, I can see the payment status as payment succeeded. So I'm just gonna continue, and over here we have the same, and if I continue this, the integration test is gonna pass. And yeah, that was it for this video. In the next one, we're gonna take a look at how we can set up a lot of test data, realistic test data for our integration tests. Until then, I'll leave over here or over here some links to some other videos that you might find interesting. Have a nice one.